Has anyone ever been to a wedding where someone actually objected, and if so, how did that go? Groom found out that bride was cheating 2 days before the wedding day. He spilled the beans while exchanging the vows. Kind of. My uncle was getting married. Small, just a handful of family and a minister. I was videotaping. My grandmother was not into it at all. With each line spoken by the minister, she had a cutting, sarcastic response. I could not believe it. It was so unlike her. When that part came up, she said, "I object." But does it really matter? They are going to do it anyway. The minister just ignored her and proceeded, business as usual. They were divorced within a year. Wish I had a copy. I had a friend who was a minister, and the subject came up if he asked the question during ceremonies he officiated. He laughed and said no way. He basically tells the couple not to include it because it only invites a moment of anxiety at best, misery at worst. His best story, and one of the reasons he stopped including the question, was a couple where the lead up to the wedding, the couple was obviously in love. The bride-to-be was very smiley and happy. Day of the wedding she's stone-faced. He knows something is up because he's never seen her like this and he asks if she is okay. "I'm fine." Right before the service he asks again. "I'm fine." He gets to the question, "Does anyone object to this union?" The bride reaches over, grabs the maid of honor, shoves her into the bride's spot and says, "You're screwing him, you marry him," and then stormed out of the church. Slightly different circumstances, but I know a guy that was the videographer at a wedding, where the groom was the one that objected to the wedding. At that point, when the priest asked if anyone objected, the groom broke down crying, and said that he couldn't go through with the wedding. Apparently he had gotten a stripper pregnant, and felt like he had to marry the stripper instead of the bride. He got pulled into a side room by the officiant, his father, and the father of the bride while everyone else, including the bride, stood around awkwardly. A few minutes later the father of the bride came out and told everyone that the ceremony was over and the wedding was off, but that everyone was welcome to go to the reception and enjoy the food. My friend didn't stick around for the reception, so I have no idea how it all turned out. But apparently the bride was understandably not taking it well. I was at one, where the groom thanked the bride's ex for dying, as his loss was my gain. Didn't help the sons of his bride and ex were in attendance. A friend of mine has a band that plays lots of weddings and other parties. They were hired for a birthday party that turned out to be a surprise wedding. The guy surprised his GF with a proposal and wanted to have a wedding ceremony then and there. She said no and left. My auntie's fiance was already married. Lady stood up waving marriage cert, so wedding didn't go ahead. The reception was on a long boat so we still went to that. The fiance went back to home country to sort it out and never came back. Not quite the question as asked, but too funny to not share. Priest, any objections? Father of the bride, lets out the hardest, loudest, most complex sounding sneeze I've ever heard in my life, completely with involuntarily saying a choo. Mother of the bride, hammered on champagne. For FS sake, Jerry. It took a good 5 minutes for everyone to regain their composure. I went to a wedding where the best man was replaced a week before because he banged the bride. But the wedding still went ahead, just with a different best man. They are divorced now. This is only tangentially related, but I had a friend I knew for like 3 months, who told me at the wedding, I was the maid of honor. Like, as the wedding was starting, I was pushed to the front. I was chosen over her own sisters. The whole wedding was that kind of chaos. It was the best wedding I've ever been to. This was in America, and the wedding was in a Buddhist temple. Parents of the groom stood up and objected because they didn't believe the bride was of the same class. They spoke in another language so most of the English speaking guests didn't know they were objecting. My husband was the best man and those closest to the couple knew this might happen. The Buddhist priest said he would handle it if the parents tried anything. After the parents spoke for a while the priest said to the groom, "You've heard what your parents had to say, what do you want to do?" The groom replied, "I want to marry my bride," so the priest asked the parents to leave. At this point the rest of the guests are cluing in that this was not a nice part of the ceremony, and that the parents were actually objecting. So, as the parents walked out, some of the guests were berating them, saying things like, "You should be ashamed of yourself," and "How could you do that?" And even though the groom was not happy with his parents, that was very hard for him to hear. That was 30 years ago. The couple is still married. They have 2 beautiful, successful children. After the groom's mom passed away, the groom's father came around and was involved in their lives until he died. A woman, in her 20s at the time, objected to her mom marrying my uncle. So she started yelling, "Mom, don't marry him," during the ceremony. The ceremony proceeded, and some family on the mom's side lead the daughter away to quit interrupting. I don't blame her. My uncle was lying. Lazy bastard. The marriage didn't last. One of my cousins is married to literally one of the kindest and coolest dudes I have ever met. Before the wedding, her little sister was saying how she's marrying my best friend. At the wedding, when the priest dude asks if anyone objects, the room is dead quiet and all you hear is a little girlish whisper, "I do." It was honestly really adorable and we all laughed, and my cousin's husband and her little sister are still best friends. At his rehearsal dinner, a co-worker's mother toast included that his soon-to-be wife was a damn dirty whore who wasn't good enough for her son. Folks not happy. Video ended, so didn't see the whole thing. At wedding which I attended, his mom started to say something at the speak now part but was silenced by her daughter. Mom left and didn't see the rest of the ceremony. Everything about that poor guy was drama. I don't know if it's a UK thing, or even just a one specific church thing, but I was told by the priest in a rehearsal that if someone objects, even as a joke, the priest is required to pause the ceremony and talk to the objector alone, to discuss their concerns and decide if they have a valid objection. Like it's not a fun jokey moment, it's a real legal part of the ceremony. He also said it used to be custom that if you raised an invalid objection, you then had to pay for the wedding. Not a wedding, but at a funeral someone objected the death. At my uncle's funeral, his ex-wife and a local church cult leader tried to raise him from the dead. We were all sitting there like normal people at a normal funeral and she walks up to the casket and starts yelling, "James Lester, raise up." I didn't know she was there or I would have prepared myself for shenanigans. Also, I didn't know my uncle's middle name was Lester, so please imagine the confusion. So she and the cult leader are literally yelling at my uncle's body. Not surprisingly, my uncle refused to resurrect himself. They were escorted out. I've actually never told this story because it makes my family look insane. Yes, at my cousin's, the bride's ex showed up, and when he stood up to object, my uncles grabbed him and bum rushed him out of the church and gave him a tune-up in the parking lot. Catholic wedding, of course. I went to a Catholic wedding where, when the priest asked this question, one of the groomsmen did a very loud, long, throat clearing, which got everyone laughing. Everyone except for the bride's elderly Italian grandmother, who marched out of her seat and angrily hit the groomsman with her handbag and shouted at him in Italian. My mother passed away about 15 years ago. 5 years later my dad married my now stepmother. It was an outdoor wedding on a beautiful sunny day, and during the spot where they usually ask if anyone objects, a big gust of wind came out of nowhere and knocked over some tables. Afterward, multiple people came to tell me that wind gust was my mother objecting, which I like to believe was true. A relative visited one ceremony, where it was asked if anyone objects, and the groom decided it's a good time for a joke and said, "I do." The lady who was going to marry the couple just turned and left. They had to go through all the paperwork again and change the date. Got married, divorced in like 3 years if I remember correctly. My grandmother objected at my sister's wedding. My sister was a Florida-based Italian Catholic and somewhat conservative individual who fell in love with a progressive New York Jew. My nonna said it wouldn't work, and it would change one of them, and she was worried about it changing her granddaughter. My parents managed to get her away from the wedding, and it continued. My sister is now neither Catholic or conservative, so my nonna was absolutely right. I objected. I took giving my sister away literally. I wasn't the brightest 3-year-old. I was the best man at my bestie's wedding. Someone that we tolerated in our friend group objected and said he was in love with the bride and that he was the only one that could make her happy. She had been nice about his feelings until then and reminded him in front of the entire ceremony that A, he couldn't hold down a job because he had too big of an ego, B, didn't get along with her friends because they all had something they were working on, a book, a career, a trip, volunteer job. And he had nothing, so he constantly tried to downplay their accomplishments and purely presumptuous ideas. And C, his idea of sex was, blow me and I'll finger you. Night, hun. She was way more thorough and more cruel, and it was a hysterical 5-minute ordeal. I mean, he had it coming or starting sit at her wedding. He got up and left. I was pretty sure he was crying as he walked away, but no one went after him. It was both brutal and hilarious. He was like the Jar Jar Binks of our friend group. You hated him, but he made you feel better because at least you weren't as bad as Peter. The mom of one of the bridesmaids got up and yelled, "Yeah, I object. You effing stole him from her," while pointing at the bride. I've known the groom for a long time and by proxy the bride. I am still very good friends with them. I have never seen her more infuriated than at that moment. The bridesmaid got up from her chair and was like, "I'm so sorry. Let me get her out of here." The bridesmaid and the bride's stepfather escorted the woman out of the wedding and it continued. My mum told me she was going to pay an old boyfriend to stand up and object at my wedding. She didn't in the end, but I did cast a quick look around in the church before walking down the aisle. My mother-in-law actually brought my wife's ex to our wedding in hopes that my wife would see him and leave me. She didn't really care other than being mad at her mom. I talked to the guy after the wedding and thanked him for coming, just to be polite. He told me that I wasn't good enough. This was a message my mill had sent a number of times, so it didn't really catch me off guard. I grabbed and shook his hand, smiled, and I told him he was a reffing creep for coming uninvited to a wedding of his ex from 10 years ago. Then I invited him to enjoy some refreshments during the cocktail hour and walked away. My wife gets mad about the not good enough comment and has him, and her mother, removed from the reception. He and my mill are still close, and she still invites him over on major holidays. I'm younger than my wife by 3.5 years, and my first impression of the guy was hearing him ask my Phil how he felt about his daughter marrying a child, so I pretty much wrote him off as an a-hole from day one. My mill permanently hurt her relationship with her daughter that day, and we didn't see her for close to a year after the wedding. My husband's first marriage. The brother of the bride stood up and said to my husband, "Say no, you can still be happy." They went through with the marriage, wound up divorcing with a messy breakup. Brother-in-law is still best friends with my husband. As far as he's concerned, he gained a brother and lost a sister and is better off for it, and he never lets him forget the fact that he was right and he should have bailed. Lol. Oldie but a goodie. This happened back in the 70s. This was shared to love by the guy who married my parents. It went something like this. "Does anyone object to this union?" "I do. That's my husband." So they paused the wedding. The bride, groom and the woman objecting went into a small room. The woman who objected provided documentation showing the groom was still legally her husband. Apparently the couple had started divorce proceedings sometime earlier but never finished. The wedding was cancelled and everyone sent home. I was not at the wedding, but know of a case where there was an objection, and the circumstances were quite exceptional. When I was a detective with a Child Protection and Sexual Offences Unit, we dealt with a case involving a 14-year-old girl who had been SA'd by a known adult male. The first disclosure of the SA made by her, at his wedding ceremony, which she attended uninvited. When the pastor asked if there were objections, she rose and said yes, she had an objection. The groom had SA her a week before. The pastor stopped proceedings and took the child to an adjacent office, where she repeated the allegation and gave more information. Shockingly, the bride was still willing to go through with the ceremony, which was concluded while the girl waited in the office. Afterwards, the pastor took her to the local police station, Belleville South in Cape Town. South Africa, where a case was opened and the matter assigned to my unit for investigation. We carried out the arrest at the V&A waterfront, Cape Town the next evening, Sunday, where the groom and his friends were partying it up. The bride, of course, was left home alone, one day after the wedding. I was blown away by the courage it took for the girl to attend the wedding ceremony alone, surrounded by the friends and family of the perpetrator, and to make the disclosure to his face in the way she did. For those wondering how she knew so much about him and when he would be getting married, he lived in close proximity to the girl's family in Belleville South and the two families knew each other. He had siblings who attended school with her. I was at a small ceremony indoors, maybe 30 people tops listening. When the minister asked for any objections, a picture of the bride's dead grandmother that was hanging on the wall fell to the ground with a loud thump. We looked at each other, but the minister finished anyway. Divorced within a year. This will sound absolutely stupid, but when I was a kid, my deeply religious aunt had her wedding at a local church. During the objecting part, lightning struck very near the church. I remember to this day how the following thunder was so loud that the fancy windows of the church started rattling. Well, the timing of the strike was very unfortunate for my uncle, because my aunt took this as a sign of a god objecting to her marriage, and called the wedding off on the spot. Needless to say, they married on the same day, a year later, and this time without objection from a god. They are still married to this day. My brother's wedding. The wife's older brother objected, because of political differences, lol. He was asked to leave by the bride's father. Not a wedding I attended, but my best friend went to her aunt's wedding. Aunt's future, toxic, Mill whips out proof from Ancestry that they are actually first cousins. Wedding was cancelled, and the bridegroom haven't spoken since. I was at one. Didn't know what happened as I was in the back. The bride runs out to the limo, her family after her. I said to the person next to me, "Cold feet?" She's like, "Oh no, I thought this might happen. Her ex is here." We went outside. He'd apparently come into a lot of money. He came to the side door front of the church, said he objected because he's rich and wants her back. She paused too long for the groom's liking, he said, "F you both." She ran. Last I saw they were at the limo with her. She was crying. Have no idea how it ended, but there was no wedding. We went to the reception. No bridal party. We ate, drank, danced, and left. My best friend, Miles, and I drew somewhat apart during college, then grew closer after college. He fell into a group of friends who were a little wilder than me. I don't blame him. College is supposed to be fun. I missed out. That's my fault because I did a 5-year program that got me my BA and MBA in short order. After school ended, he was asked by a new friend to be his best man. I knew the guy and his fiancée secondhand. He was a bit of an ogre and she was cute, a bit mousy. I wasn't at the wedding, but the big day comes and we all go about our lives. It was the 90s and I worked that Saturday. Yes, office space culture was real then. I go out to our watering hole that night and there was my best friend, drinking a double whiskey in a disheveled tux. Good wedding? How was the reception, grub? I asked. No wedding. No reception. I ate dinner at Applebee's by myself, he said. The bride told the limo driver to take her for a few big laps. She eventually showed, gathered her family around her, and told the groom it was not happening today or ever. The physical and mental abuse was too much and she was too far into a drug habit he pushed on her, and was going to seek help. Now understand, only if you at the wedding knew any of the abuse or drug abuse was going on. The ogre went into a rage, tried to attack her, and got repelled by the better men and women in the crowd. She got her help and self-confidence back and married a great guy a few years later. 3 kids, almost 30 years together. Her would-be husband kept up his bad habits and ended up killing his girlfriend and himself in a drug-fueled murder suit in our 30s. Still shocks me to this day. My best friend has been pretty much straight and narrow since. It sobered him up in many ways. Well, sort of. It was staged, prearranged, and the minister was warned ahead of time. The couple said they wanted to make the ceremony more interesting. So they had a friend object, declaring his love for the bride in an over-the-top dramatic speech. The best man, my husband, stabbed the guy with a stage dagger, he played dead, and 2 of the other groomsmen dragged his limp body away. The wedding proceeded. I have to say, it was pretty awesome. The bride and groom are still happily married 30 plus years later. I used to make wedding videos. Did one at an outdoor wedding spot high on one side of a valley. It had rained earlier in the day but the storms had cleared and the wedding could continue. During the vows I don't touch the camera, just step back and let it run. So I'm spaced out waiting for the vows to finish and notice a radio tower far across the valley. Suddenly lightning hits the radio tower. I had enough time to think, boy, when the thunder gets here, it'll probably be loud. I also had enough time to clue in that the minister was saying, if anyone objects to this union let him speak now or forever. Kablam. Total silence in the venue. Preacher takes a second to look around and make sure everybody is alright. On one has been smoked. Well, that's never happened before. As far I know, they're still married. That was 10 years or more ago. I perform weddings but I do not give the option. I tell the bride and groom ahead of time that the guests have accepted the invitation to your wedding to bless it. If they have a problem with your decision they need to tell you long before that day. I didn't really think people gave that option outside of Hollywood. It just invites trouble. I take a similar approach for funerals. While I let families give as many eulogies as they want to for their deceased loved one, they must approve each speaker ahead of time. I do not pass the mic. I don't want some estranged lover or drunk uncle getting up and making a fool of the family or the deceased person. So far, so good. Not exactly an objection but the wedding was on a boat, no one could leave, and the groom was Jewish and marrying a Mexican Catholic woman. The groom neglected to tell his family it was a full Catholic wedding and the groom's family stood up and pitched a fit when they realized the groom was going to take communion. The uncle who sponsored his bar mitzvah stood up and announced that the groom was a disgrace to the family and walked downstairs. The reception was a shit show. My cat was my best man, and when our friend who ordained our wedding asked if there were any objections, he let out a long ass meow. Haven't been to personally, but my mom said that her soon-to-be Mill stood up when the priest said, "Speak now or forever hold your peace." Upon being told that, I never let it go. My mom worked her ass off and got all her 6 kids into college. Screw that old lady, some people just can't appreciate others. To this day she doesn't like my mom but, to be honest, their whole family never deserved my mom to begin with. Can anyone relate? Attended a wedding where the minister said something along the lines of, if anyone here objects to this marriage, you can keep your mouth shut. Today is not about you.